guys. So, this week we're going to be talking about the ethical culture at a business. And before we get into the details of what ethical cultures are and what might be some sort of best practices for uh, designing and shaping the ethical culture at a business from a managerial point of view, I want to take a step back to kind of motivate this discussion. Why are we talking about culture at all? What's the point of talking about this stuff? Um, I think that we like to think that how we respond to moral challenges as individuals is a matter of our personalities and upbringing. So, features of ourselves that we carry across all the situations that we encounter in our daily lives or even extraordinary situations. I respond to moral challenges the way that I do because of how my parents raised me or because of the sort of person I am deep down. Um, Now, this is, I think, something like the conventional wisdom, but it's not quite right. To a great extent, our behavior is determined not by our personalities and sort of deep features of ourselves, but by the situations in which we find ourselves, sort of contingent facts about what's going on around us when we have to make difficult choices. So, what choices are most convenient? What choices are perceived as normal, as expected among the groups of people that I find myself in? Can I blame anybody else if I screw up? Am I going to be held personally accountable for my choices? So there's a sort of mountain of evidence in social psychology of this. Just to give you a sort of greatest hits for starters, maybe one of the most famous psychological experiments ever, or series of experiments, is Stanley Milgram's obedience to authority experiments. Fun fact, there's a professor in the psychology department at Brooklyn College who helped run some of these experiments, who was one of Milgram's students. And you may have heard about these before. So in the typical obedience to authority experiments, there were zillions of variations, but in the typical experiment, you've got three people involved in the experiment. You've got the actual subject who doesn't know what's going on. You've got a person who's sort of playing a scientist or playing an experimenter, and they tell the subject that they're involved in this frankly kind of silly psychological experiment about teaching people new words, lists of words. And then there's a third person, somebody in the other room who's supposed to be the learner. So there's the subject, the scientist, and the learner. And every time the learner makes a mistake in learning this new list of words, the subject is supposed to press a little button on a machine that shocks this person. This person gets a painful electrical shock. And on this machine, you can see a kind of dial going up. They think every time the person makes a mistake, they're increasing the voltage that they're using to shock this person. And there's like a skull and crossbones or something at the most extreme end of the dial. I mean, saying that it's supposed to be fatal to this person. And so when so this person isn't actually being shocked; they're an actor. But every time the subject presses the button to shock this person when they make a mistake, the person sort of yelps out in pain, "Ow, ow, hey, what the hell are you doing?" And finally, when you press the sort of fatal shock button, they don't say anything after that. So subjects in this experiment are led to believe that they're actually at serious risk of killing people for just because some scientist is telling them. And the sort of famous result, Milgram initially designed these experiments because he was, after World War II, he was curious, what is it about the sort of German personality that led to Nazism developing in Germany and not in, other countries? But what Milgram found is that, well, it doesn't matter if you're German or if you're from the United States or if you're from anywhere else, you're going to be roughly equally likely to shock people to death just because some scientist in a white lab coat who looks kind of official tells you to do it. Now, there are a bunch of different variations on this experiment, but some of the lessons that Milgram and his colleagues took away from these variations is that people seem to be more willing to issue deadly shocks when they think that when they're told that they have no choice, the experiment must go on, as the person playing the experimenter says to the subject. And when they think that they can blame the experimenter, that it's not on them, that the experimenter is ultimately held responsible. So when you think you can blame other people for your own mistakes, when people in positions of power tell you what to do and tell you that you have no choice, people will do awful stuff. And it's not just extraordinarily bad people. Frankly, most of us would probably do it. That's what these experiments show. Okay. Another sort of classic experiment in social psychology in this vein is Ash's conformity experiment. So in this experiment, there's like three lines that are drawn on a board or on a piece of paper or something, and the subjects have to answer a very simple question, which is, which line is the longest? And it's not hard. If you're not visually impaired, you can look at these three lines, and one is clearly the longest. Now, here's the thing: only one of these people is the actual in this experiment is the actual subject, but they're in a room full of other people who are actors who are participating in this experiment. And what the actors are told to do is they're told to say the wrong answer, one after another. So here you are sitting in this room being asked this very, very simple question: which line is longest? And then all of the people around you are saying, this short line over here, line A, whatever, that's the longest. And you could imagine sort of what happens to a person when they're in this sort of experiment. They're sort of sitting there thinking like, well, C is obviously the longest, but I mean, I don't know. Maybe something's wrong with me. Maybe I didn't hear the instructions correctly. Or I just don't want to. I don't want to be the weirdo who gives the wrong answer, who gives the aberrant, the non-conforming answer when everybody else around me is saying the same thing. So people will say stuff that is obviously false. They will, either because they believe it or because they are afraid to speak up. They're afraid to speak the truth when they see that everybody around them is saying that false thing. So okay, people will act in ridiculous, reality-denying ways if they think that this is sort of normal and that other people around them are acting this way as well. Another classic experiment in this vein is Darley and Batts' Good Samaritan experiment. So there were a bunch of seminary students, people training to be priests or ministers or whatever, and they're told they had to go deliver a sermon on the parable of the Good Samaritan, which is a Bible story about helping a stranger in need. And as they're on their way to go deliver this sermon, they pass by a person who's actually an actor, but it looks real. They pass by a person sort of groaning in pain in like in a doorway, just sort of somebody who's clearly in serious distress. Well, here's the experiment. Half of the people in this, half of the seminary students are told that they have plenty of time, that they're like, they're not running late or anything to go deliver their sermon. The other half of the people are told that, look at the time, you're like already a couple of minutes late. You got to get a move on. So you could imagine what happens. The people who believe that they're running late don't stop to help, and the people who tend not to stop to help, it's more likely for them to keep on going to their sermon. And people who believe that they have plenty of time tend to stop to help. They're more likely to stop to help. Okay. So if you ask these people, why did you stop? I don't think they would say, well, because I thought I had plenty of time to go to my sermon. They'd say, well, I'm just a giving person. I'm a man of the cloth or whatever. So if it's if people believe that they have time, for example, or if it's convenient for them to make an altruistic choice and other regarding a helpful or caring choice, that can encourage them to do so. There's another experiment sort of in the same vein, but slightly different, from Croson et al., having to do with keeping up with the Joneses. So if you tell people that in an organization you're doing some charitable fundraiser, and you tell people in the organization that other people have already donated X amount, they've already donated, I don't know, $50 a person or whatever, those people will be relatively likely to give to the charity. If you tell them that, other people, haven't donated so much so far, they'll be relatively less likely to donate. There are variations on this with recycling. If you tell people that their neighbors are more likely to are all recycle, they're more likely to recycle themselves, or more likely to report that they recycle themselves. If you tell people that their neighbors don't recycle, then they don't recycle. People, sometimes one philosopher has summed up these results of these and similar experiments by seeing that people aim at moral mediocrity. People don't want to be morally exceptional for the most part. People don't want to be that much better than their neighbors. And people also don't want to be that much worse than their neighbors. People sort of set their kind of moral standards by what they think other people around them are doing. Just descriptive social information about what the people around them are up to. Okay, so you can, one of the sort of situational determinants of how you act in a situation is not so much your personality or what sort of person you are or what your upbringing was, but what you believe about how other people act around you in that same situation. One last experiment that's worth describing here is from Eisen and Levin. This is a little different, but is relevant, I think. So there was an experiment in which they were subjects were told to make some call in a payphone. We don't have payphones anymore, but sometimes back when there were payphones, there'd be like a little change slot, and sometimes every now and again you'd look in this like change slot, and the last person would have forgotten to get their change, so you could find like an extra 25 cents in the payphone. It's like, great, I'm up 25 cents. And after they made this call, some of the subjects were found a dime in the payphone. Other subjects did not find a dime in the payphone. And after subjects sort of made their payphone call or whatever, they were asked if they would donate by somebody who was part of the experiment, if they would donate to some charity. And, lo and behold, the people who had found the dime recently, the people who were in a relatively good mood, would donate to charity, were more likely to donate. So, to the extent that a mood is a sort of passing feature of a person, it's not a deep feature of their personality, it's sort of a contingent feature of the situation that you find yourself in, sort of like, where's my emotional state right now? What's my mood at right now? People's giving behavior, at least, and perhaps some of their other moral behavior, is determined by the mood that they're in. Oh, he's Grapple. So, okay. So, these are all experiments which show different ways in which the personality of a person, the person's upbringing, the sort of deep features of a person that they carry from one situation to the next, doesn't determine how they confront some sort of moral challenge or how they act in a kind of morally demanding situation. So, if you're trying to think about how you can promote moral behavior in a business from a managerial point of view, you might think, well, I just need to hire the right people. I need to hire people who have the right personalities, who have the right upbringing, who have the right sort of deep moral character. And that'll do something. I don't think that there is no such thing as a person's moral character, but it's at least as important to create situations, to create an environment in which good choices are convenient and expected, and people can't pass the buck, for when they make bad choices, when people can't sort of defer responsibility or blame other people when they fuck up. Okay, so what does this have to do with culture? Well, a lot of this is a matter of culture. I mean, if you want to create an environment where good choices are convenient and expected and so on, this and just somehow facilitated in one way or another. That's largely a matter of creating the right sort of culture. Okay, so that brings us to Trevino and Nelson. They define culture as a body of learned beliefs, traditions, and guides for behavior shared among members of a group. So everyone is a member of multiple cultures, right? So I am, a person who lives in Brooklyn, so there are sorts of beliefs and traditions and guides for behavior that sort of people in Brooklyn tend to share. I was raised in a certain socioeconomic class, in a certain ethnicity, with a certain religion. That is a sort of, those are all have sort of cultures that they bestow on me. If I listen to heavy metal or punk rock or something, then, if I participate in those like scenes, then I might like be a member of one of those sorts of cultures, a metal culture or a punk culture or something like that. Good. So, it's not just, so businesses in particular will also have cultures. So there will be a body of learned beliefs, traditions, and guides for behavior shared among the workers and managers and owners at a business. So different cultures can bring out different sorts of behavior in one and the same individual. So, if I'm a Buddhist and I go to my Buddhist temple, and that's the sort of culture that's sort of active in determining my behavior at that moment, I'm gonna act in a way that presupposes that other people around me know a little bit about Buddhism, that the moral standards are going to be set by our sort of shared Buddhist beliefs, and so on. But then that same day, I leave my Buddhist temple and I go to the punk rock show, and now I don't expect everybody to know anything about Buddhism. I don't expect everybody to live up to a sort of Buddhist moral code or anything like that. I will just expect people to act like you act at in whatever the punk scene is or something like that, and I'm going to act that way myself to a great extent. I'm not going to drop pieces of Buddhist jargon or something around, or I'm not going to comport myself in a bodily way in the same way that I would at a temple. Okay. So that's obvious, but different cultures will bring out different behaviors in one and the same person at different points in time. Trevino and Nelson make a distinction between strong and weak cultures. This maybe isn't the best label, because strong doesn't mean good and weak doesn't mean bad. But what they mean is that a business has a strong culture if a lot of sort of cultural inheritance is shared across the entire business. They give the example of Citigroup, or excuse me, Citibank prior to the formation of Citigroup. So Citibank, like in the 90s, and one of the authors worked at Citibank at the time and went to some Citibank branch in Japan. They were based in the United States, and they went to a Citibank branch in Japan and were sort of shocked to discover that people in Japan basically acted the same way as in the Citibank branch in Japan, basically acted the same way as the people at the Citibank branch in the city, and or in the United States rather. And it's like, what the hell's going on here? This is people from Japan don't always act exactly like people from the United States. Of course, human beings, we have a lot of things in common, but but Japanese culture and U.S. culture are very different in other respects. So why is this the case? Well, it's the case because Citibank has a strong culture. There are features of the business and how it's run that sort of encourage a sort of uniformity across all different branches of the business, even branches located in very different countries. Okay. Um, um, a, a weak culture, I would say that Brooklyn College, for example, has a weak culture. This is not necessarily a bad thing, but, because a lot of students don't, some students' sort of social lives revolve around school. Most of their friends are friends from school. They spend a lot of their time there. They hang out at school or whatever. But I think a lot of people, maybe the majority of people at Brooklyn College, they kind of clock in and clock out. It's for some people are residential students. They live in the campus housing a few blocks away from the main campus. But most people are commuters. They live in other neighborhoods. They commute. Maybe they commute from other boroughs. They commute from the Bronx or from Manhattan or Staten Island or whatever. And so, sort of the their behavior is not sort of very deeply in class, is not very deeply influenced by a sort of shared culture that everybody has at the school. Everybody's kind of off doing their own thing. I think different departments within Brooklyn College act very differently. I've noticed that business students are, some, not to say that business students sort of always are like this, but in the past, when I've taught business ethics, like students are generally more punctual than the philosophy students. Like they show up on time. Which is sort of funny. I think like one thing that I've noticed, like at the philosophy department, like within the philosophy department, the philosophy majors are like pretty chill. They're like very friendly with each other. But then like there are other majors on campus where it's not especially chill. It's people don't get along. People aren't really friends with each other. They don't really feel at home or comfortable, or they might kind of be a little bit buttoned up or a little starchy when they're they might not hang out in the department at all. Okay, so that's one way that you could tell that this is a weak culture, not necessarily a bad culture, just a weak culture, in that different people in different sort of parts of the school will act very differently, will have very different norms, and as Trevino and Nelson point out, that can be a good thing, because maybe you don't want everybody at Brooklyn College to act the same. Brooklyn College has what, like 15 or 16,000 students? Do you really want them all acting the same way? Maybe you want people who are part of this club or this clique to hang out on their own. There are a lot of returning students. Do you want the like 18-year-olds to act the same way as the people in their mid-40s or whatever? Well, that's a little weird, So like maybe it's okay or good that there's a weak culture here. Okay, anyway, strong cultures are cultures in which the sort of standards or guides for behavior are shared across the entire institution and highly determine people's behavior across the entire institution, so that people end up acting the same way no matter sort of where you go. Weak cultures are ones where there are a lot of different subcultures where people act differently within the same institution. Okay, good. So the ethical culture. So what about ethical culture? So the ethical culture of a business is the aspect of the business's culture that expresses its moral values and encourages or discourages moral behavior. So some features of a culture don't really have anything to do with ethics. So maybe there are features of the culture which have something to do with sort of how you dress. I mean, that can be an ethical thing if there's a focus on modesty for moral purposes or something like that, dressing modestly. But there could be sort of expectations about what sort of music you listen to or something like that. So not every aspect of a culture is moral or has to do with expressing moral values or encouraging or discouraging moral behavior. But other aspects of a culture do. So maybe Brooklyn College has a really strong plagiarism policy. So, everybody, I don't know that this is the case, uh, but, suppose that at Brooklyn College, every class had exactly the same plagiarism policy. Students didn't sort of like expect each other to plagiarize. It's like you'd be embarrassed to like tell fellow students that you had plagiarized something. And there are strong rules against plagiarism or something like that. So that would be a feature of the ethical culture of the business. It would be an ethical culture which discourages plagiarizing in various ways. On the other hand, you could have a bad ethical culture. You could have a culture which, some schools are, this is especially the case for grad schools, but I think it's also true in undergrad schools and, high schools and so on. Some schools students are very competitive about their like class ranking or whether they're seen as the best students in their class or something like that. Other schools are not that sort of way. So, if there's a kind of super competitive, backbiting, nasty culture where people aren't, where your fellow students aren't seen as people that you're sort of engaged in this cooperative enterprise with, but they're seen as potential competitors, then I think this will encourage immoral behavior. So that's a feature of the ethical culture of a school too. Saying that a school has an ethical culture doesn't mean that it has a good or bad ethical culture. Okay, so strong doesn't mean good, weak doesn't mean bad. Having an ethical culture doesn't mean being good. You can have an ethical culture that encourages moral behavior or discourages moral behavior, that promotes the right sorts of values or doesn't promote the right sorts of values. Okay. Trevino and Nelson distinguish between formal and informal systems that make up the ethical culture at a business. And we will talk about the formal systems today and the informal systems for next class. Formal systems are systems that are sort of governed by explicit rules and policies. Things are that are sort of in writing or somehow codified in the rules and structure of an institution, the basic organization of an institution. Informal systems are not explicit or not rule governed. They're passed on by word of mouth or indirectly or implicitly by just how people around you behave. So again, we'll talk about formal systems this time and informal systems next time. So Trevino and Nelson distinguish a bunch of formal systems that contribute to the ethical culture of business. Executive leadership, the selection and hiring system, policies or codes, orientation and training, performance management, authority structure, and decision processes. Okay, so let's break this down a little bit. So executive leadership, they somewhat confusingly say this has some informal elements and some formal elements. But executive leadership is just sort of is made up of two components, they say. The moral person, so what sort of reputation does the executive have, or do the executives have at some business? Do the people in upper management or in the C-suite have? And moral management, which is like, how do they run the business to promote or not promote moral behavior? So, does the they say that executives tend to live in glass houses so that their behavior is more public and more scrutinized and just more visible to the people at a business as well as the general public than the average worker. So do they make a show of living by certain sorts of moral values, or do they have a reputation for just being sort of ruthlessly concerned with making money or profit or the bottom line? Do they have a reputation for certain sort of moral character traits, for being honest or caring or friendly or brave or forgiving or whatever? Or do they have a reputation for particularly immoral character traits, for being dictatorial, or cruel, or narrow-minded, or just disrespectful to their inferiors, or something like that? Okay. So there's the moral person of the executive leader. What sort of example do they set? You know, the saying that the fish rots from the head down. So if the example that's set by the leaders is a shitty one, then you can expect that example to be replicated elsewhere in the business. Well, you know, if this guy up here, if this executive gets away with being such a dick, then maybe to the people who sort of work directly beneath him, then maybe I get to be a dick to the people who work directly beneath me. Okay. So there's the moral person. There's a sort of personal reputation that the leader has. There's also the question of moral management. So in some businesses, executives communicate a lot with the workers, with the other employees, with the other people at the business. In some businesses, they don't communicate very much. But if they do communicate, then what do they communicate about? Is official communication sort of just about the bottom line? Is it just about profit? Is it just about sort of the bare bones of legal compliance without sort of respecting the moral spirit of the law, or something like that? Or do they communicate about values? Do they routinely talk about caring for one another, about compassion, about honesty, about integrity, about helpfulness, you know, about any kind of moral value at all? So there's also a question of like how they make decisions. Do they have a this is sort of perhaps a matter of the moral person, but you know, maybe it sort of could go in either column. Do they govern in a kind of top-down way that doesn't solicit or respect input from other people, or do they actively solicit and respect input from other people? And you know, if you do, then you're going to encourage that sort of behavior in others, and if you don't, then you're going to discourage that behavior in others. Okay, so executive leadership can help shape the moral behavior at a business by setting an example and through the management style of the leader. Okay. There's what about the selection and hiring system? So Trevino and Nelson point out that, you know, when you hire new people or select people for promotions or raises, you do that on the basis of certain criteria, and those criteria might be involve sort of moral checks of one sort or another, or they might not. So do you promote people strictly for the amount of business that they've brought into the firm? Do you promote people for strictly for what they contribute to the bottom line, or do you number of sales they've made, whatever it is? Or do you promote people because they have a reputation for their own sort of moral behavior, or because of the quality of the relationships that they build with the people around them? Do they help foster a friendly, supportive, compassionate environment? Do they put people on their best behavior in one way or another, or do they not? So when you're when you're promoting people, you know, what sorts of criteria do you use? You know, ask yourself, when you're hiring people, what sorts of you know, there's going to be some checklist of questions that you ask in an interview, and you might ask yourself, well, what's on that checklist? Do any moral questions come up here about questions about how people would behave in morally compromising situations, questions about what that person's values are, questions about what that person would do to promote moral behavior in the business. So you can So are you hiring people strictly on the basis of sort of non-moral considerations? Oh, this person went to this school, they got promoted this quickly in their previous employment, whatever. Okay. There are also questions about whether the interview questions or the hiring and promotion process, the selection system at a business expresses the moral commitments of the business itself, not just whether it's sort of like considering moral features of the people involved in hiring and promoting processes, but are the questions that are asked in the interview basically moral or immoral questions? So, I think we talked at some point, at least in one of the classes, about the ban the box movement, and there's a lot to say about this. It's arguably a mistake, or it failed, or it was incomplete, or it didn't go far enough, or something like that. But you might have had in the past, and still in some states and municipalities, you could ask when people are applying for a job whether they've been convicted of a felony, and the presumption is, well, you're not going to hire felons. So what does that say about the forgivingness, the mercifulness, the sort of attitude towards social responsibility or helping the community out at the business? So by asking that question, you sort of express certain values. You express, in particular, the value that you think it's okay, or that formerly incarcerated people shouldn't be trusted, or something like that. So you might want to ask yourself, well, do you really have those? Do you really have those values? One controversial question. There's a lot to say about banning the box. About banning the box where you ask people to sort of check off whether they've been convicted of a crime. But that's one of them. That by asking this question, you express certain sorts of moral values, and you might ask, well, are those the values that I want to express? Asking about salary histories, I think, is also a way of expressing certain values. So when you ask about, again, this is complicated, but when you ask a person's salary history, how much they've been paid in the past at their previous jobs, when they're applying for a new position, part of what you're doing is saying, I'm looking for leverage against you. So I'm looking for people who have been paid poorly in the past, so that I can continue to pay them. So that I could use that as a justification to continue paying them poorly in the future. You're saying that you're sort of going into this potential employment relationship with a person in a kind of spirit of competitiveness or hostility. You're saying that you're going to reward people who are especially sort of savvy or cunning, or maybe a little sneaky in their salary negotiations, over people who are less willing to do that. And so, by asking about salary history, I mean, this sort of might look like a kind of innocuous or innocent question, and there's a lot to be said. We could have a discussion about whether you think it is, but you do express certain sorts of values having to do with the proper role of competition inside of a firm, or between management and employees, by asking this sort of question. Okay, so you can ask yourself. So you can promote moral behavior by including moral criteria in how you select and hire new people, and by asking yourself what sorts of moral values are expressed by the sorts of questions which I'm asking in interviewing new job candidates, or interviewing people for promotions and so on. Okay. You can ask yourself about or another sort of formal system that's relevant here, and we've talked about this a little bit sort of incidentally over the last few weeks as we've talked about sort of particular moral issues that come up at the workplace. But usually a business will have a code of conduct or some sort of office manual. And usually this code of conduct or office manual will give some kind of guidance about how to deal with morally difficult situations. You know, the employee handbook for Brooklyn College gives you guidance about how to deal with students who plagiarize and cheat on tests and exams and things like that, papers, whatever. So one question is, do you have a code of conduct or an office manual at all? And if you do, does it just sort of deal with kind of non-moral issues? Oh, you know, here's how you clock in and out. You know, here's, you know, how you're expected to appear at the workplace. I mean, that can be a sort of moral matter again, like I said. But or does it, you know, does it give guidance about how to deal with morally problematic situations or morally challenging situations? Okay. There's also a question of what you do with those. So are there rules on the books about how to deal with morally challenging situations, and are those rules made available to employees at a business? Okay. There's a second question. This brings in the question of alignment, which Trevino and Nelson talk about. So you could have a business where maybe the rules say that you know, plagiarism is wrong or something like that. You know, you have a school where, you know, there's rules about plagiarism, but nobody follows them. It's like, yeah. Well, the rules say don't plagiarize, but, you know, fuck the rules. Nobody cares about plagiarism. Okay. So you could have a code of conduct or an office manual which tells you about, say, sexual harassment. So here's how you can, here are sort of guidelines for how you should address your employees. Here are guidelines for romantic relationships at the office, and so on. And then, you know, and then you see people around you sort of flagrantly violating those rules, or when people do violate those rules, the rules are never enforced, or people who violate the rules are promoted within the company, and so on. So Trevino and Nelson bring in the concept of alignment to say that a company's culture is aligned if all of its systems work together to promote the same sorts of behavior. So you know, if you have a rule on the books against sexual harassment, that's not enough. You need an aligned culture. So you need do you also have the leadership talking about sexual harassment or referring back to those rules regularly? Do you have do you see harassers being promoted routinely? Do you see these rules being reinforced in orientation on the job, or you know, professional development or job training things? Do you see people being punished for breaking the rules, and so on? One question is, like, do you just get, so one question about these codes of conduct is to say, like, do you just get the code of conduct and then you never have to see it again? Or do you get the code of conduct and you're referred back to it very frequently? Does the code of conduct play a big role in how you're oriented into the business? Do people talk about it? Okay. One interesting psychological result is that when people are given codes of conduct that sort of, or they're given some sort of, maybe not the entire code of conduct, which might be unreadable in a single sitting, but they're given some sort of one pager of like the values that the business has, you know, values of honesty and integrity and compassion and you know, cooperation rather than competition between coworkers and so on. You can if you ask people to sign these codes of conduct or these like one-pagers expressing the values of a business, there's some evidence that that will actually encourage that behavior, that even though there's like no repercussions that come with this, I mean, just signing a document, there's evidence of this with like honor codes in classrooms, that if you have students sign an honor code saying that they're that they won't cheat, or they're gonna be helpful to their classmates or whatever, they're much less likely to cheat, or they're significantly less likely to cheat. Okay, so the question isn't just what do the rules say, but also the question of how they're reinforced. So that moves us on to some other formal systems. Are they reinforced in orientation and training? So when people are oriented into a business, well, how are they oriented into a business? Are they given a mentor who is sort of friendly and warm and encouraging them to develop sort of trusting, cooperative relationships with the people around them? Or are they thrown into the deep end? And, is the orientation sort of like a series of, a series of tests or some kind of gauntlet that you feel like you're constantly at risk of being fired? Or is it sort of more welcoming or warmer in some way or another? Does the orientation just teach you about how to just sort of do the bare minimum of doing your job, or sort of basically learn the ropes of, how you accomplish the tasks that make up your job description that you have to do every day? Or does, I'll let the ambulance pass there. Okay. Or does the orientation also deal with how you deal with morally challenging situations? What do you do when you have a concern and your manager doesn't take it seriously? What do you do when you see sexual harassment, or you think you're being sexually harassed? How do you address your coworkers? What are the policies with respect to conflicts of interest, and navigating different types of relationships in the office that might interfere with your sort of primary employment obligations or something like that? So does the orientation express and reinforce the right sorts of values? Does it deal with values at all? Or is it just sort of like a bare minimum of like, here's how you, crank this out, here's how you use whatever piece of software we use in this office, or whatever it is? Okay. A couple more systems. Trevino and Nelson discussed performance management. So this is what are people rewarded for? What are they punished for? How are they compensated? So, we've talked in the past in this class about being paid on commission. Well, if you're being paid on commission, then that's going to tell people there's one thing that determines your wages, and it's making those sales. So if that's what you're paying people for, if that's what you're rewarding people for, then it's sort of like you do that and don't worry about anything else. Like that's, so, your compensation scheme can reflect the values of the business. So, and it can encourage certain sorts of behavior rather than others. A more generous maternity or paternity leave policy would express certain sorts of values, compensating people for or otherwise rewarding people for sort of moral behavior rather than behavior which has to do with sort of narrowly has to do with the bottom line. So, do you have some kind of employee of the month club type club, not employee of the month club, employee of the month sort of award? And what's that award granted for? I remember when I was in college, I went food shopping with some of the guys that I lived with, and we went to the supermarket, and and the cashier was just very, very good at stuffing extraordinary amounts of groceries into a single paper bag. So these paper bags they weren't like going to split open or overflow or anything, but she was like very good at sort of like playing Tetris with her groceries. And it was like, we were joking around. It's like complimented this cashier on her ability. She was around our age, as I recall, and she was like, "Yeah, well, that's I got employee of the month last month for my ability to stuff lots of stuff into a bag. And so it's like, well, what do you have what sort of people get the Employee of the Month award? Is it people who are very good at stuffing groceries into bags, which is not necessarily a bad thing to do, but it doesn't have anything to do with morality? Or do you get Employee of the Month for helping somebody who's in distress, for sort of promoting cooperation, for promoting sort of fellow feeling or team spirit or something like that? Okay. So, there are ways of rewarding behavior that aren't just paying people. Maybe most of the ways of rewarding people aren't just paying people. This isn't just me being bitter, but maybe it is me being bitter. Like, I've often had the thought that, like, being told thank you by an employer, by a manager, is just incredibly important. And this isn't necessarily the fault of anybody who's supervises me in my work at Brooklyn College. It's more a function of kind of how Brooklyn College is set up. That I'm not supervised very closely at all. Most of us aren't. People were working in the classroom, but it's like, God, it would be nice if somebody who worked here told me thanks every now and again. Thanks for doing this or that or the other. I'm exaggerating, but I think places where people are just where you show appreciation to your employees for either for not moral behavior, for just saying thanks or showing appreciation for bringing in business, or showing thanks or appreciation for moral behavior. So how is, this is a long way of saying that we have all sorts of ways of promoting behavior. We also have ways of paying people with money, Employee of the Month type programs, just informal communication. This is less of a performance management thing than although it could, you could have some policy on the books about when you say thank you to your employees, or trying to say thank you a lot. There are also similarly, different ways of punishing behavior. Are people, promotions, people rewarded through promotions, raises, whatever. Okay. There are also ways of punishing people for their behavior. So are people, what gets you fired at your job? Do you get fired for being a jerk to the people around you? Do you get fired for getting a workplace injury and like not being able to keep up with your job? Do you get fired for having sort of personal problems which affect your ability to do your job, and your employers aren't necessarily super understanding of, like, maybe you're depressed, maybe you have some mental health problems, maybe you just have a lot on your plate personally at home, whatever it is. So, what are people punished for? Are people punished for sort of how their behavior sort of narrowly affects the bottom line of the firm, or are they punished for behavior which contradicts the moral values that you'd want the business to promote? Okay. Moving on. Different businesses have different sorts of authority structures, so they can be more vertical. So, this person is in charge of this person is in charge of this person is in charge of this person. Or they could be more horizontal. So, everybody sort of works side by side. There's, decisions are made more democratically. You don't have sort of big or deep sort of chain of command that you can go up or down. Okay. So, again, this is complicated. There might be some businesses where a more vertical organization makes more sense. There might be businesses where a more horizontal organization makes more sense for purely financial reasons. Or sort of basic organizational reasons, basic reasons having to do with the sort of industry that you're operating in and the sort of product or service that you're providing. But, a more vertical organization will tend to lead to more kind of authority involving ethical culture, and a more horizontal organization will be less of that. There will be less of sort of deference to authority. And if you look at Milgram's obedience to authority experiments, one lesson that you might take away from those is that when people feel like they can pass the buck, when people feel like they can always defer responsibility to somebody else, then they will do awful stuff. Okay. So there's a question of whether the organization is vertical or horizontal, and what sorts of values are promoted or expressed by it. There's also the question of just like who has what jobs. So is there a legal compliance office? Is there an ethical compliance office? If there's an HR department, who is HR responsive to? Is HR do you get the sense that HR is really just working for management to cover their asses and limit their liability? Or is HR working for everybody so that, even if somebody who's not in management is, the victim of some mistreatment, then, HR can help them out. Do you have somebody if there's some moral problem, which is very important to you, do you have somebody who's in charge of dealing with that problem? If, diversity is really important in your firm, do you have somebody who's in charge of making the firm more diverse? What sorts of tools do they have at their disposal? Is there just some diversity officer and it's just some token position and they're sort of kept in some corner? Or do they have are they given actual power to make the firm more diverse in one way or another? Do you have, okay. So asking yourself what do we pay people for? What people have what sorts of job descriptions? And are some of those job descriptions sort of explicitly about the promoting the moral values of the business? Okay. Lastly, you can ask what sorts of decision procedures are in place. What sorts of rules and procedures are there for making decisions? So, you can, something that's come up in the past few weeks when we've talked about sort of how to deal with, I think really this came up when we were talking about gender discrimination, is if people are, a lot of sort of discriminatory behavior is made possible by people being allowed to make decisions on the basis of their own stereotypes without having to justify those decisions in sort of more objective terms. So you could just sort of look at the person of color who's applying for a job and say, this person just doesn't seem like the right fit. And you look at the white guy who's applying for the job and say, that seems like a good worker right there, or whatever. So are hiring decisions made in a way that's sort of more subjective, more up to the sort of judgment of the individual a person or committee involved in hiring, or is there or not? When groups of people have to make decisions, are there any steps taken to avoid groupthink or conformity? So in some firms, when groups of people are tasked with solving some problem, there will be a single person in the group who's sort of told to be the devil's advocate, told to just their job is to disagree with other people in the group, and that way it's like it's that person's job, so maybe you won't take it out on them you won't take it out on them or you won't hold it against them, but that way sort of groupthink, types of sort of conformity of thought which are sort of just held in place by each person believing that everybody else thinks it's normal, rather than each person sort of making their own best sort of reasoned guess or reasoned judgment about the truth. Groupthink can be sort of encouraged or discouraged by setting up group decision-making processes in one way rather than another. So, you know, are decisions in general sort of made by individuals working on problems alone, or decisions in general made more democratically, made by committee? If they are made by committee, how do you prevent them from being sort of excessively bureaucratic or not transparent, or just sort of uh, 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 obscure to the people who aren't participating in the committee? Okay, so so decision procedures can um, uh, uh, express and promote moral values in different ways, partly by giving people more or less latitude to make um, biased or prejudiced or stereotyped choices, partly by encouraging people to cooperate rather than sort of having each person sort of siloed off working on their own little thing, partly by encouraging people within, encourage, you might say, sort of true democracy, each person sort of making their own sort of reasoned guess and reasoning with other people to come to the best opinion, rather than people sort of meekly conforming to what they think everybody else thinks, or something like that. Okay. So much for formal systems. I know that was a lot, but we will turn to informal systems and some related tools for promoting ethical cultures at a business next time. Uh, um, the email in which I'm sending out this lecture is long and complicated, but I hope you read through it carefully. We have a lot of work to do in the coming weeks. We're almost done with this class. You can see the light at the end of the tunnel here. Hopefully that turn of phrase isn't too morbid at this time. Okay. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I will see you guys